The most famous saint in history was executed by the Church as a heretic. This is the central searing paradox of Joan of Arc, and in that contradiction lies a story far more complex than the legend we know. It's a story not just of faith and fire, but of whispers in royal courts, of calculated risks, and of a teenage girl who became the most powerful political symbol in a kingdom on the brink of collapse. The question is not simply whether her visions were real, but who stood to gain from them. To understand Joan, you must first understand the despair of France in 1429. The 100 Years' War had raged for nearly a century. The English and their Burgundian allies controlled the north, including Paris itself. The English king claimed the French throne, and the rightful French heir, the Dauphin Charles, was a weak, disinherited, and indecisive figure hiding south of the Loire River. His own legitimacy was in doubt. Even his own mother had signed a treaty disowning him. France was not just a kingdom at war, it was a failed state, a nation that had lost its soul. It was a kingdom in desperate need of a miracle. And then, a miracle appeared. She came from the nowhere village of Domremy, a 17-year-old peasant girl who could neither read nor write. She claimed to hear the voices of saints, Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret, who had given her an impossible mission from God, to drive the English out of France and see the Dauphin crowned king at the cathedral in Reims, the traditional site of coronations that was deep within enemy territory. The historical records, even those written by her enemies, attest to the raw, unshakable conviction she possessed. It was a conviction that allowed her to walk through a war-torn country, persuade a local garrison commander to give her an escort, and arrive at the Dauphin's court in Chinon. Here, the legend and the political reality begin to merge. The famous story is that Charles, to test her, disguised himself among his courtiers, yet Joan, who had never seen him, walked directly to him and bowed. A miracle! But the records also show what happened next, and it was anything but a simple act of faith. Before Charles would grant her an army, Joan was sent to the city of Poitiers to be examined for 3 weeks by a panel of the highest theologians in the land. This was not just a religious test, it was a political vetting. They needed to ensure her visions were from God and not the devil, yes, but more importantly, they needed to ensure she was a safe asset. Was she controllable? Did her message align with their political goals? Her virginity was physically verified by a committee of noblewomen, including the Dauphin's powerful and shrewd mother-in-law, Yolande of Aragon. A virgin peasant girl sent by God was a potent symbol of purity and divine right. A non-virgin claiming the same was a heretic and a political liability. Before Joan could be a saint, she had to be a carefully vetted political tool. She passed every test. The desperate court, led by figures like Yolande, likely saw the immense potential. This girl was the perfect propaganda. In an age of deep faith and superstition, a divine messenger could do what no general could: inspire a demoralized and broken army. Charles, a man paralyzed by doubt, was offered a divine guarantee of his own legitimacy. It was a wild gamble, but they had nothing left to lose. They gave her a suit of white armor, a banner bearing the names of Jesus and Mary, and a small army. Her target, the city of Orléans, which had been under a brutal English siege for months and was on the verge of falling, a loss that would have shattered what remained of French resistance. The professional French commanders were skeptical, even dismissive. They had tried and failed to break the siege. What could an illiterate teenage girl possibly do? They were about to find out that symbols can be more powerful than swords. The official histories of the Siege of Orléans, written by both French and English chroniclers, are baffled. They struggle to explain what happened next. The French army, beaten down and passive for months, was suddenly galvanized. Joan did not command in a traditional sense. She did not devise complex strategies. Instead, she became a living banner, a focal point of almost supernatural morale. She would ride to the front lines, her standard held high, calling on the soldiers to trust trust in God and attack. She was wounded by an arrow, a fact recorded by all sides, yet she returned to the fight, further cementing the belief that she was protected by a divine power. Within 9 days of her arrival, the English siege, which had seemed unbreakable, was shattered. The English, terrified by what they saw as a witch's sorcery, retreated in disarray. The Maid of Orleans was born. The victory was a political earthquake. It was proof the miracle Charles and his court had gambled on had materialized. For the common soldier and the French populace, Joan was a saint walking among them. For the English, she was a demon sent from hell. But for Charles and his advisors, she was now the most valuable political asset in Europe. They immediately capitalized on her momentum, launching a stunningly successful campaign up the Loire Valley. City after city fell, not always to force, but often to the power of her reputation. Her presence was enough to make garrisons surrender. She was fulfilling her promise. Now only one part remained: the coronation. On July 17, 1429, Charles VII was crowned King of France in the cathedral at Reims. Joan of Arc stood beside him at the altar, her banner in her hand. This was the pinnacle of her life, the absolute fulfillment of the mission her voices had given her. And it is at this precise moment of triumph that her story begins to darken, and the line between visionary and pawn begins to blur. With Charles now the anointed, legitimate king, Joan's primary political purpose had been served, but her divine mission, in her mind, was not over. Her voices were now urging her to march on Paris and drive the English from the heart of France. But the newly crowned king and his court hesitated. The historical record shows a distinct shift. The bold, aggressive strategy that had won them the crown was replaced by a return to cautious diplomacy and truce negotiations. The war was expensive, and King Charles was, by nature, not a risk-taker. Had he ever truly believed in her divine mission, or had he only believed in its utility? Now that he had his crown, was this charismatic, fiercely independent holy warrior becoming more of a liability than an asset? The court's financial support for her campaigns dwindled. Her attack on Paris, undertaken with limited resources, failed. For the first time, the Maid of Orleans had been defeated, her aura of invincibility broken. The following spring, in May of 1430, she was captured by Burgundian soldiers during a minor skirmish outside the town of Compiègne. The historical accounts of her capture are confusing. Some claim the town's drawbridge was raised too soon, trapping her and her rear guard outside. Was it a tragic military blunder, or was she deliberately abandoned? We will never know for sure. But what we do know is what happened next. Nothing. King Charles VII, the man who owed his crown to this teenage girl, made no serious military or diplomatic effort to ransom or rescue her. His most valuable asset was now in the hands of his enemies, and he did nothing. A king does not simply abandon a proven messenger from God, but a king might very well abandon a political tool that has served its purpose and has become dangerously unpredictable. Joan was sold to the English, who had a very specific use for her. They didn't just want to kill her, they needed to destroy the miracle she represented. Joan's trial for heresy at Rouen was one of the most meticulously documented trials of the Middle Ages. The English and their French collaborators understood the stakes. This was not a trial about faith, it was a political assassination disguised as a theological inquest. Their goal was simple. If they could prove that Joan's visions came from the devil, not God, then she was a heretic and a witch. And if she was a witch, then Charles VII was a usurper, crowned by an agent of Satan, rendering his entire claim to the throne illegitimate. The trial was designed to destroy not just Joan, but the king she had created. What the transcripts reveal, however, is not a cowering peasant girl, but a mind of extraordinary clarity and courage. For months, this uneducated teenager was cross-examined by a panel of learned, hostile theologians who laid complex theological traps for her. Yet time and again, she parried their questions with what witnesses described as astonishing wit and wisdom. When asked if she was in God's grace, a classic trap, to say yes was blasphemous pride, to say no was an admission of guilt, she famously replied,
If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God so keep me." Her inquisitors were left stunned. Where did this brilliance come from? Was it divine inspiration as she claimed, or was it the native intelligence of a prodigy, sharpened by an unshakable sense of purpose? But the court held all the power. They wore her down with months of interrogation, shackled in a man's prison, threatened with torture. The central charge against her became the act of wearing men's clothing, which the church deemed an abomination. Finally, under immense pressure and facing the horror of being burned alive, she broke. She signed a document of abjuration, a confession of her sins, in exchange for life in prison. The legend says she had betrayed her voices, but the historical record suggests something more sinister. After recanting, she was supposed to be moved to a church prison and given women's clothes. Instead, she was returned to her old cell. A few days later, the judges found her once again in male attire. This was a relapse into heresy, which carried an automatic death sentence. Why did she do it? The traditional story is one of defiance, that her saints rebuked her for her weakness, and she chose martyrdom over a life of betrayal. But other accounts suggest she was tricked. Some chroniclers claim her dress was taken from her during the night, and she was left with nothing else to wear but the men's clothes. She may have been a victim of a cruel setup, a final manipulation to ensure her death. Whatever the truth, the verdict was sealed. On May 30th, 1431, Joan of Arc was taken to the marketplace in Rouen, tied to a stake, and burned alive. She was 19 years old. Her story should have ended there, as a heretic and a witch, but 25 years later, a new trial was held. King Charles VII, having finally won the war and secured his kingdom, could not allow his legacy to be tainted by the fact that he was crowned by a condemned heretic. He authorized a nullification trial, which meticulously re-examined the evidence from the first trial, declared it corrupt and illegal, and posthumously cleared Joan's name. She was officially declared a martyr. It was the final posthumous act of political maneuvering. The tool that had been used to win him a crown and then discarded was now polished and enshrined to secure his own place in history. She was a pawn in her life, a pawn in her death, and a pawn in her legacy. So who was she? Was she a divinely inspired saint who changed the course of history? Was she a brilliant but naive young woman whose deep faith was exploited by a desperate political machine? Or was she something in between, a phenomenon that both the French and the English tried to define and control but never fully could? The historical record provides evidence for all theories, but a definitive answer remains just out of reach, lost in the smoke of her pyre. Her power, perhaps, lies not in who she was, but in the questions she forces us to ask about the nature of faith, power, and the stories we choose to believe.